Since World War II, more interest has been taken by economists in the problems of backward and less developed countries. Thus, you being the students of economics of development, you must understand and distinguish between the concepts of economic growth and economic development. Whereas development may not result from economic growth must result from economic development. Economic growth is the concern of advanced countries. Economic development is a major issue for the developing nations. As the ultimate objective of economic development is human development, and development strategy must aim at improving the standard of life of the people. Moreover, as the economies are classified into developed and underdeveloped, one must understand the different features of two categories as well as the reasons for the persistence of gap between the two categories. The unit will also give the factors which show the measurement of levels of growth and development across various nations. After learning this module, you will be able to understand the study of economic growth and development is important to know not only the rate of increase in output and capacity, but also the mechanism by which this rate is realized, sustained or impeded. After studying this module, you shall be able to 1. Learn the concepts of economic growth and economic development. Second, you will be able to analyze that while economic concept, economic development, they are different because economic growth is a single dimensional concept while economic development is a multi-dimensional concept. Thirdly, you will be able to identify that economic development has a social content as well as the quality of life should be the focus of economic development. You will be able to learn the concept of economic development and the features which differentiate these underdeveloped economies from the developed economies. And fifthly, you will be able to examine the factors which are responsible for the perpetuation of the conditions which keep the underdeveloped countries as underdeveloped today. Sixthly, you will be able to evaluate various ways through which the economic and social aspects of development can be estimated, and the gaps in various indices will measure the problem of development. So, let's discuss the definition and understand the concepts of growth and development. The concept of economic development has taken a central place in economic literature today since World War II. Although economists like Karl Marx and even some of the classical economists explained about economic growth and development, it has now become a special area of study. The key element of development is that people are the major participants in the process of change in an economy as well as in the enjoyment of benefits flowing from these changes, and this process of change in the economy is referred to as economic development. The traditional approach to the concept of development was strictly in economic terms, where an economy is transformed from a low level of economic activity to a higher level of economic activity. Development process here implied some forces working over a period of time to change certain variables which result in the growth of national product. While growth is only a quantitative change, the process itself will have some other changes which can be classified as A. Changes in factor supplies, which comprise of the discovery of additional resources, B. the capital accumulation, C. the population growth, D. the new technology, and the last is skill formation, as well as institutional and organizational changes, and thereby changes in the structure of demand due to the change in level and distribution of income, as well as due to the changes in the structure of production and employment. The quantitative approach towards growth was based on the policy of inducing industrialization at the expense of agriculture. The concepts of poverty elimination, the reduction in inequality, the generation of employment were assumed to be the outcome of rapid growth in GDP and GNP per capita. Since a vast majority of the world population could not get the benefits of economic growth, this narrow approach of development had to be redefined. Therefore, while growth involves focusing on the increase in height or weight, or basically GNP, development draws attention to changes in both functional and learning capacities. In the early stages, any economy that grows is likely to develop. But the study of development, which shows an absence of both structural changes to reduce complementary growth in other sectors and of institutional changes to diffuse gains in all sectors, has necessitated the focus back on the problem of development. The achievements in enhancing GNP has been indeed remarkably significant in certain countries like Brazil, South Africa and Oman, but their success in delivering public health, education and enhancing the expectancy and reducing mortality has been quite dismal. What Professor Sen has termed an example of unarmed opulence, while the countries like China and Sri Lanka with relatively quite low income levels have made significant progress in the public provisioning of these services. The concept of development therefore has been redefined to include direct attack on the problems of poverty, unemployment and inequalities, etc. Thus, economic development is a wider concept which not only includes improvement in material welfare but also includes changes to fulfill the objectives of eradication of mass poverty along with its correlates of illiteracy, morbidity and early death. It also includes changes in the structure of output, a change in occupational structure and changes in institutional and organizational setup along with changes in allocation of resources. Moreover, it also includes changes in attitudes of people which make them more rational and more modern in outlook and behavior. As Kindleberger puts, wherever economic growth merely refers to a rise in output, economic development implies a change in technological and institutional organization of production as well as the distributional pattern of income. Thus, while economic growth is a single dimension concept, economic development is a multi-dimensional concept which includes both an increase in GDP per capita as a primary goal as well as a number of sub-goals like poverty alleviation, reduction in inequalities, more employment opportunities and improving the living standard of masses. Now, Moving on to discuss the underdevelopment and the common characteristics of underdeveloped countries. Since the end of World War II, more interest has been taken in the problems of backward and less developed countries. Although there is no single definition of underdevelopment which is universally acceptable, yet there are certain indicators on which there is a consensus, and those can be used to identify the underdeveloped countries. The United Nations experts have defined an underdeveloped country as the one which has a real per capita income that is lower in relation to the real per capita income of USA, Canada, Australia and Western Europe. Thus, underdevelopment is a relative concept as it involves comparison of one set of countries with the other. It refers to the state of an economy where levels of living of masses are too low due to low per capita income resulting from low level of production. Although it's a relative concept, yet it sustains absolute poverty also, wherein more than 30% of the people fail to fulfill their basic needs of food, clothing and shelter. But an underdeveloped country should not be identified as a potentially poor countries. These economies have the capabilities for achieving higher growth rates, and they only need a big push through some concerned domestic factors as well as some outside help. They also need some internal reorganization to make them move in the desired direction. These are the countries whose actual and potential resources have not been fully utilized due to lack of capital, technological backwardness and unskilled manpower. These have good potential for development if provided with sufficient capital and with modern technology. Even the Planning Commission of India has observed an underdeveloped country is one which is characterized by the coexistence of unutilized or underutilized manpower on the one hand and of unutilized natural resources on the other. The state of affairs may be due to the stagnancy of techniques or to certain inhibiting socio-economic factors which prevent the more dynamic forces in an economy from asserting themselves. Even World Bank in its World Development Report has classified countries as low income, middle income and high income countries. This classification is based on per capita GNP, and the data shows that low income countries comprise 12.5% of the world population, but they account for 0.7% of the total world GNI, while high income economies which have only 16.5% of the world population account for 71% of the world GNI. The middle income countries which account for 71% of the world population have only 27.4% of the world GNI. Thus, lower and middle income groups taken together, which are known as developing economies, comprise about 83.5% of the world population, but they account for only 28% of the world GNI. Most of these countries are in Asia, Africa, Latin America and some part of Europe. The most common characteristics of these economies are low per capita income, widespread poverty, high rates of population growth, low levels of productivity, unemployment and underemployment, weak infrastructure, more dependence on primary sector, low rates of capital formation, unequal income distribution, poor quality of human capital, dualistic nature of the economy, and low social indicators as well as sociological factors. Thus, underdeveloped countries are low income countries whose resources have not been fully utilized. These economies can achieve high rates of growth if their resources are fully utilized by mobilizing more capital and by utilizing the modern technology judiciously. Now, we shall discuss about the factors which perpetuate underdevelopment of an economy. The history of modern economic growth and development shows that it has not affected all corners of the globe. While in some parts the economic performance in the aggregate has led to a thorough transformation of a country's economic and social framework, there are countries which have been remained untouched and the conditions of underdevelopment perpetuate. We can therefore discuss those factors which have been responsible for the perpetuation of underdevelopment between nations. These factors include A. Agricultural conditions. The influence of agriculture to achieve sustainable living is generally underestimated, but in fact agriculture is the cornerstone of rural development and thereby poverty alleviation, particularly for developing countries. The major challenges in this sector, like fragmented land ownership, low public and private investment levels, low productivity, keep the role of this sector limited, particularly in rural socio-economic development. Even trade liberalization to create equal market accessibility could only benefit the developed nations. The lack of modern technology, the comprehensive support this sector has kept the rate of growth low in both this sector as well as in the overall economy. The second factor which is responsible for perpetuation is the urban bias. The government policies based in favor of metropolitan areas have encouraged migration from rural areas and thereby increasing facilities for the urban population may promote growth in the short period, but it won't produce long-term sustainable and equitable development. Industrial investment, if promoted at the cost of agriculture, and will force migration to urban areas. This distorts urban labor market and restricts comprehensive economic development in the absence of rural development, especially the agricultural development resources, particularly unskilled labor shifts to the urban areas and stimulates social unrest and thus perpetuates underdevelopment. The third factor responsible is rapid population growth. Rapid growth of population in most of the African and Asian nations is due to the factors like poverty, illiteracy, unemployment and social norms. The bulk of the population growth is in these countries which are underdeveloped. This ever increasing number is putting pressure on land, housing, other services and infrastructure. As these economies fail to provide sufficient food, housing, health, care and education, this promotes persistent underdevelopment which is further compounded by poverty. Overpopulation even leads to environmental degradation, thus high population hinders both social and economic development. Another factor responsible for perpetuation of underdevelopment is institutional framework. Institutions are those rules and conventions which govern human behavior and social interactions. These form the social structure on which the edifice of economic development can be built. Since these are the constraints, imposed by the society and are both formal and informal in nature, development requires that these institutions are reformed. Although formal institutions can be easily changed with the help of law, but it takes a long time to change the conventions and codes of behavior which depends on the mindset of the society. Since the changed formal rules work only in a social setup which is willing to accept these changes, it is necessary that the informal constraints must change. Thus, development is not simply related to use of material resources, but is also linked up with institutional framework. Any economy caught up in the traditional and primitive institutional setup cannot expect a high rate of development unless the institutions are modernized. Another factor which affects perpetuation is dualism. By dualism, we mean the coexistence of developed and modern sector with traditional backward sector in various parts of the economy. While the modern sector uses scientific and sophisticated technology and is guided by the profit motive, the traditional sector uses outmoded techniques and produces for self-consumption. The economy is thus divided into two major segments, one which is well organized, prosperous and progressive, the other is in poverty, backwardness and misery. The dualistic situation also becomes a cause of stagnation and underdevelopment in these economies. So, these are the major factors which perpetuate the underdevelopment of the economy. Now, we will move to understand the measures of economic development. Since development is a multidimensional phenomena, no single measure of economic development completely describes such an intricate and subtle process. However, most economists follow the spirit of Lord Kelvin's assertion that we are unlikely to know much about a subject unless we can measure it in some way. The multiplicity of development goals, therefore, can be shown by a variety of development measures. For example, when we are interested in material output, we measure it in terms of GNP or GDP. Levels of mass poverty are indicated by the income distribution, the utilization of resources by sample surveys, and the quantitative aspect of economic development is measured through various social indicators. Therefore, we will use all these measures in measuring economic development. The first and the most important measure of economic development is the GDP, which measures the total value of goods and services produced within a country during a year, or GNP, which also includes the net income from abroad, or GNP per capita, which is obtained by dividing the total value of GNP by the population of the country. Here, a distinction has to be made between the level, which is crude indicator of average welfare, and the rate of change, which indicates the speed and direction of change. A country grows if its total income increases, but since our interest in development is for human welfare, income per capita is more important, which takes into account the size of the population and can provide some information about efficiency. But there are some theoretical and practical problems of using GDP, GNP or income per capita as a measure of development. The basic problems faced are: 1. It remains hard to draw a line between consumption and cost, or between final product and intermediate product. 2. The valuation of goods and services is difficult. 3. The exclusion of government spending on administration and distribution in particularly socialist economies create a problem. 4th, the informal economy and the unpaid work such as homemaker services and subsistence farming and bartering also create problem. 5th, the high informal sector as rural economy cannot give the accurate information. And the 6th, it hides inequality in distribution even within a country. 7th, the negative externalities like pollution and environmental damage is not included in GNP. 7th, the benefits of environmental services are not excluded in GNP. Thus, GNP is only a measure of economic value of what is produced and paid for. It does not take into account the environmental and social costs as well as the distribution aspect of the income. There are a number of other problems faced whenever an attempt is made to reduce national product originating under different social conditions to comparable aggregates. Therefore, in order to measure economic development, we can take and evaluate a country's development performance. We can use measures of the extent to which people in the country receive the benefits of development process. One approach is to look at the indices of absolute poverty. Those living in a situation where they are unable to satisfy their basic needs for survival, food, clothing, shelter, water and sanitation, for which the World Bank gives an income of $1.25 per day, and that of relative poverty, a level of poverty relative to the rest of the population which has been taken as 50% of the average earnings, and inequalities in income distribution which has increased over the planning period in India. Inequality becomes a problem when differences in income across the sections of society are deemed to be excessive and perpetuating. An alternative approach to measure development is in terms of social indices, which may be single component indicators or it may be composite indicators using multiple components. These social indices give us some idea about public quality of these are A. Demographic statistics on mortality and fertility, out of which the first factor will be the population growth rate can indicate the stage of demographic transition the country is at, which can be linked to development. 2. The infant and maternal mortality rate, the fertility rate, the life expectancy, the percentage of GNP spent on health, the doctors and hospital beds per thousand of population, and the levels of urbanization in an economy can also be linked to development. Other social indices which can also measure the level of development in an economy are A. The percentage of GNP spent on education, B. The literacy rates including male and female literacy rates, C. The full-time teachers per thousand people, D. The number of people having higher and professional education, E. Access to safe water, and percentage of GNP spent on housing and dwelling floor space per capita, and thus the single components can measure the economic development. Besides single components indices, there can be multiple component indices which comprise a number of single components to give a combined score. Let's now understand the development gap. The development gap refers to the widening difference in levels of development between the world's richest and the poorest nations. Although this development gap can also occur within countries, that is between regions or between urban and rural areas, but here we are concerned with development differences between rich and poor nations. In order to measure development gap, we can evaluate all those indicators which are used to measure development, such as A. GDP, GNP per capita, in which the gap between India and USA is around 40 times, while the average GNP per capita in India was $1180, that of USA was $47,240 at the official exchange rate. B. The employment structure and GDP contribution of agriculture also indicates the wide gaps between the two countries. While in USA only 4% of the population worked in agriculture and its share in GDP was only 1.3%, the ratios were 58% and 17% in India. As far as the consumption of energy is concerned, while per capita consumption of electricity in USA was 7,766 kilogram oil equivalent, in India it has been only 529 kilogram of oil equivalent. D. Nearly 1% of the bottom household own only 10% of the assets, and 10% of the rich own 49% of the assets in India, which shows the extent of inequality in the world. Around 1/3 of the population in India lives below poverty line. Besides, not only in economic indices, even the social indicators show a wide gap between developed and underdeveloped nations. While life expectancy in USA was 79 years, in India it was 64 years. The literacy ratios were 99 and 66 respectively in the two nations. The infant mortality rates and the total fertility rates were 53 and 2.6 in India, while they were as low as 4 and 1.2 in the country like Korea. While India ranked 134 in HDI index, Canada occupies the 4th place in this index. The PQLI index and the International Sufferings Index, which covers daily calorie intake, access to clean water and communication, inflation and political freedom and civil rights, also indicate the similar types of gaps. Therefore, it is clear that there are wide gaps in the development indices in developed and less developed nations. Now, we will summarize what we have learnt in this module. It is clear from the discussion above that while economic growth in terms of sustained increase in real income is a unidimensional concept, economic development on the other hand involves many structural and functional changes. More recently, the focus of development has been shifted to the quality of life and enrichment of human life, as the ultimate aim of all development is improving the well-being of the people. The unit also examines some diverse features of underdeveloped countries which differentiate these economies from the developed economies. Since no single definition or characteristic of economic development can capture the multidimensional nature of this concept, no single measure of development can completely describe its intricate process. Therefore, the multiplicity of development goals is seen by a variety of development measures. These may range from material output to social indicators. Moreover, since many of the countries could not transform their economic and social framework, a few factors have been discussed which are responsible for the perpetuation of the problem of underdevelopment in these economies.